The house stood at the end of a dirt road where no one visited anymore. Eleanor Whitaker gripped the steering wheel as her 3 children stared through the dusty windows at their new home, a structure that looked like it had been holding its breath for decades. The lawyer's words still echoed in her mind. There's a condition. She hadn't told the children yet. Hadn't told them that the roof over their heads came with strings attached, that their fresh start was built on someone else's unfinished story. Caleb, 11 years old, turned to look at her with eyes too knowing for his age. "Mom, why is no one else here?" Eleanor swallowed hard, tasting dust and dread. Eleanor woke each morning to the sound of footsteps above her head, the family who owned the house moving through their routines while she and her children existed in the shadows below. The air smelled of mildew and old cardboard, and no matter how many times she washed the donated blankets, they retained the scent of someone else's charity. 3 months had passed since David's funeral, 3 months since the heart attack that took him on a Tuesday morning, leaving behind unpaid medical bills and a checking account with $240. The life insurance policy he'd promised existed turned out to be paperwork he'd never completed, always meaning to get around to it next week, next month, when things settled down. Things never settled down. Before we continue this journey together, I need your help. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you powerful stories like Eleanor's. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means we can continue sharing these emotional journeys with you. Lily, 3 years old, spent most days sitting silently on the thin mattress they all shared, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had belonged to her father. She rarely spoke anymore, and when she did, her voice came out as barely a whisper. Owen, 8, had stopped bringing home artwork from school, stopped creating anything that might reveal the chaos inside him. He moved through days like a ghost, present but unreachable. It was Caleb who worried Eleanor most. At 11, he had begun checking the door locks at night, counting the canned goods in their small food stash, asking questions about bills and rent that no child should care about. He watched her with an intensity that made her heart crack, waiting to catch her if she fell, ready to become the man of the house because someone had to be. Eleanor worked 3 part-time jobs that barely covered their basic needs. Morning shifts at a diner, where the owner paid cash under the table. Afternoons cleaning houses for families who looked through her like she was furniture. Evenings doing data entry from a library computer, racing against closing time. She slept 4 hours a night if she was lucky, moving through her days in a fog of exhaustion that made everything feel slightly unreal. The town had once thrived on manufacturing, factories that produced parts for larger factories somewhere else, a whole economy built on being a cog in someone else's machine. Then the plants closed, one after another, and the town began its slow collapse. Storefronts went dark. Families moved away. Those who remained grew harder, more suspicious, clutching whatever they had left with white-knuckled desperation. Eleanor had grown up here, left for college on a scholarship that felt like escape, then returned when David got a job at the last remaining factory. They'd planned to save money and leave again, but savings never accumulated. There was always something. Car repairs, medical co-pays, school fees, life bleeding them dry one small cut at a time. Then David was gone, and she was alone with 3 children in a town that had stopped believing in second chances. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, official and intimidating with a law firm's return address. Eleanor opened it standing in the basement, surrounded by plastic storage bins that held everything they owned. Her hands shook as she read the formal language, the legal terms that meant something simple and impossible. Someone had left her a house. The letter provided few details: a property in Montana, inherited through David's family, available for immediate occupancy. There was a phone number for an attorney named Robert Chen, office hours listed below. Eleanor read it 3 times, certain she'd misunderstood, that this was some kind of mistake or scam. But the letterhead looked legitimate, and the property address was real enough to find on a map. She called during her lunch break at the diner, standing in the parking lot with traffic noise making it hard to hear. "Mrs. Whitaker, yes, we've been trying to reach you," the attorney said, his voice professionally neutral. "The property belonged to your late husband's uncle. The estate was settled 6 months ago, but locating you took some time." "I don't understand. David never mentioned an uncle with property. They weren't close. There are some conditions to the inheritance which we'll need to discuss in person, but the short version is this. You have a house waiting for you, fully paid, with clear title. If you're interested, we can arrange the transfer immediately. Eleanor felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. A house, a real house, not a basement or a shelter or a friend's couch, but walls and a roof that belonged to her, that no one could take away. The conditions barely registered. Whatever they were, she could handle them. She'd already handled worse than anyone should have to. "I'm interested," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "When can we make this happen?" What Eleanor didn't know, standing in that parking lot with grease-stained polyester clinging to her skin and hope rising in her throat like a dangerous tide, was that the house came with a weight heavier than mortgage payments, that the property at the end of the dirt road had stood empty for a reason, that some inheritances arrive wrapped in obligation, and the price of walls and a roof might be more than she could afford to pay. But that discovery would come later. For now there was only the envelope in her hand and the impossible possibility of a fresh start, of gathering her children and driving towards something that might, against all odds, feel like home. The drive to Montana took 2 days in a car that threatened to quit with every rattling mile. Eleanor had sold what little they owned, furniture that wasn't theirs, electronics bought on credit, David's tools that she couldn't bear to look at anymore. The money covered gas, cheap motel rooms, and drive-through meals eaten in parking lots while the children slept in the back seat. Caleb sat in front, navigator and co-pilot, tracking their progress on a gas station map with the seriousness of a military commander. The landscape changed as they drove west. Flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against endless sky. The towns grew smaller and farther apart until civilization felt like something they were leaving behind rather than moving toward. Owen pressed his face against the window, watching the world expand into distances he'd never imagined. Even Lily seemed to wake from her silence, pointing at horses in distant fields with something almost like excitement. They reached the property on a late afternoon when the sun hung low and golden, casting long shadows across overgrown fields. The dirt road leading to the house stretched for nearly a mile from the main highway, rutted and neglected, making the car bounce and protest with every yard. Stands of pine trees bordered the property on 2 sides, dark and dense, while open grassland rolled away toward mountains on the horizon. The house emerged gradually, like something surfacing from underwater. 2 stories of weathered wood siding, once painted white, but now faded to grey. A wraparound porch sagged in places, but held firm in others, suggesting bones that were still solid beneath the decay. Windows stared out like tired eyes, some cracked, others intact, all covered with years of accumulated dust. The roof showed patches where shingles had blown away, but the overall structure remained sound, a building that had survived through stubbornness rather than care. Eleanor cut the engine, and they sat in silence, staring at what would now be home. "It's big," Owen said finally, the first words he'd spoken in hours. "It's creepy," Caleb added, but there was curiosity in his voice beneath the wariness. Lily just held her rabbit tighter, watching the house like it might move if she looked away. Eleanor forced brightness into her voice. "It needs work, but it's ours. Come on, let's look inside." The front door stuck, swollen from humidity and neglect, but yielded to Eleanor's shoulder. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of dying sunlight that sliced through dirty windows. The entryway opened into a living room with hardwood floors, scratched and dulled, but still present beneath decades of grime. Furniture remained, a couch with springs visible through torn upholstery, chairs that might collapse if anyone sat on them, tables covered in mouse droppings and dead insects. The kitchen had ancient appliances that Eleanor wasn't certain would work. Cabinets hung crooked on their hinges, and the sink dripped with a steady rhythm that suggested broken pipes somewhere in the walls. But there was space, counters for preparing meals, a table where they could eat together, windows overlooking the backyard, where wildflowers had claimed what might once have been a garden. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms waited in various states of decay. The master bedroom had a leak-stained ceiling and wallpaper peeling in long strips. Two smaller rooms faced the front of the house, their windows offering views of the dirt road and distant highway. The fourth bedroom, tucked at the end of the hallway, was the smallest, but also the most intact, pale blue walls and a window seat built into an alcove, cushion long rotted away but the frame still solid. "I want this one," Lily whispered, the first full sentence she'd spoken since they left. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Then it's yours, sweetheart." They spent the first night on sleeping bags in the living room, clustered together more from habit than necessity. The house made sounds as it settled, groans and creaks that spoke of age and emptiness, of a structure adjusting to human presence after years alone. Caleb lay awake long after the others slept. Eleanor could tell by his breathing, both of them listening to their new home introduce itself. The next morning, Eleanor drove into the nearest town, 15 miles away, population 2,300 according to a faded sign. Main Street consisted of a grocery store, hardware shop, diner, bank and post office, along with several empty storefronts that once held businesses the town no longer needed. People watched her with the careful neutrality of those who'd learned not to expect newcomers. At the hardware store, buying cleaning supplies and basic tools, the clerk, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair, studied Eleanor with open curiosity. "You're the one who took the Whitaker place," she said, not a question. "Yes, we just arrived yesterday." The woman nodded slowly. "Been empty a long time. Probably needs a lot of work. We'll manage." "I'm sure you will." The clerk bagged the supplies with practiced efficiency, then paused. "Town's not much, but people help each other when they can. You need anything, you ask. Most folks remember what it's like to start over." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you. I appreciate that." Walking back to the car, she noticed the looks, some curious, some sympathetic, and a few that quickly glanced away when she met their eyes. She recognized that last expression. It was the look people wore when they knew something you didn't, when they carried information that felt too heavy or complicated to share with strangers. Back at the house, the children had begun exploring the property. Owen discovered a shed in the backyard containing rusted tools and mysterious equipment. Caleb found a path leading into the pine trees, deer tracks pressed into soft earth. Lily sat on the porch steps, feeding crackers to a squirrel brave enough to approach. Eleanor stood in the driveway surveying the work ahead. The house needed everything, repairs, cleaning, basic maintenance that would take months. But it was theirs. She could look at these walls and not feel the weight of someone else's charity, could make decisions without permission, could finally exhale after months of holding her breath. Her phone rang. The attorney, Robert Chen, his number saved from their previous conversations. "Mrs. Whitaker, I hope you arrived safely. I wanted to give you a few days to settle before we discuss the full terms of the inheritance." His voice carried a careful formality that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "What full terms? You said the house was mine." "It is, but there's a condition that wasn't included in the initial letter. I thought it best to explain in person, but given the distance, a phone call will have to suffice." He paused, and Eleanor heard papers rustling. "The previous owner, Marcus Whitaker, your husband's uncle, specified that the property transfer is conditional upon you providing care for a dependent." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of dependent?" "Marcus himself. He's currently in a care facility, but the testamentary terms require that he be moved to the property and that the inheritor provide daily care, medical attention as needed, and companionship. The arrangement continues until his passing, at which point the property becomes yours without condition." The world seemed to tilt. "You're telling me I have to become a caregiver? I'm not qualified. I don't have medical training." "The care required is primarily companionship and basic assistance. He's mobile but frail, needs help with meals and medications. The facility where he's currently residing would provide initial training and ongoing support. And if I refuse? The property reverts to the estate and would be sold. The proceeds would fund his continued facility care." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight settle on her shoulders, heavier than she'd imagined, more complicated than simple repairs and fresh starts. She thought of the basement they'd left behind, of Lily's whispered words claiming the blue bedroom, of the way Caleb had finally smiled when they pulled up to a house that was theirs. "When would he need to move in?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Within 30 days of the property transfer. I'll send the paperwork and facility contact information. I'm sorry this wasn't clearer from the beginning, Mrs. Whitaker. Marcus was very specific about wanting family to care for him, even distant family he'd never met." After the call ended, Eleanor stood motionless in the driveway while her children played in the yard, unaware that their fresh start came with strings attached, strings that might pull tighter than any of them could bear. Eleanor sat in the county office building, fluorescent lights humming overhead like trapped insects, while Robert Chen spread documents across a scratched wooden table. The room smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner, and through a small window she could see the parking lot where her car sat with Caleb watching his siblings. "I should have told you before you drove all this way," Chen said, genuine regret in his voice. The firm handling the estate initially believed the care arrangement was temporary. "We only discovered the full scope when we reviewed Marcus's medical records." Eleanor studied the papers, legal language that transformed human obligation into contractual terms. "Tell me about him, about Marcus." Chen opened a folder, though he seemed to know the contents by heart. Marcus Whitaker, 78 years old. He worked as a mining engineer, spent most of his career overseas. Never married, no children. He purchased the Montana property 30 years ago, but rarely lived there. Used it as a landing place between contracts. About 5 years ago, he returned permanently when his health declined. Why did the family abandon him? That's complicated. Chen removed his glasses, cleaning them with a meticulousness that suggested he was buying time. Marcus made choices that damaged relationships. He lent money to relatives that was never repaid, then demanded it back at the worst possible times. He said things at family gatherings that cut deep, truths people didn't want to hear, delivered without compassion. He wasn't cruel, but he was rigid, unforgiving of what he saw as weakness or poor decisions, so they left him alone to punish him. More like they left him alone to protect themselves. By the time he realized what isolation felt like, the bridges were burned. Your husband David was the only one who occasionally called, though they hadn't spoken in years when David passed. Eleanor traced the edge of a document with her finger. "And now I'm supposed to fix this? Take care of someone who drove away everyone who actually knew him?" The testamentary condition isn't about fixing anything. It's about dignity. Marcus knows he failed his family. This is his attempt to ensure he doesn't die alone and neglected, even if it means bribing a stranger with property. Chen's voice softened. "You're not obligated to accept. But before you decide, you should understand what refusal means." He pulled up information on his laptop, turning the screen toward her. Photographs of the house, professional shots taken years ago when it was maintained and beautiful, appraisal documents showing current market value, $340,000. The mortgage-free property represented wealth Eleanor had never imagined possessing, security that could change everything for her children. If you decline, the house sells within 60 days. Marcus returns to the facility indefinitely. The sale proceeds fund his care until he passes. Then whatever remains goes to medical charities. You walk away with nothing. Eleanor's throat tightened. "How long would I need to care for him?" His doctors estimate 6 months to 2 years. He has congestive heart failure, managed but progressive. He's not bedbound, can dress and move independently, but needs monitoring, help with medications, and shouldn't be alone for extended periods. I have 3 children. I need to work. How am I supposed to provide constant care? The estate provides a monthly stipend for his expenses, food, medical supplies, utilities. It's not generous, but it covers basics. You wouldn't need to work full-time, though part-time income would certainly help. And Marcus is lucid, capable of being alone for short periods. He just can't live entirely independently. Chen slid another document across the table. A waiver, a contract, an agreement that would bind Eleanor to this arrangement. The facility has agreed to provide training. 2 weeks of instruction on his medications, dietary needs, emergency protocols. They'll do home visits monthly to ensure proper care. If at any point you're unable to continue, the agreement terminates and the property reverts. Eleanor read through the terms, each paragraph adding weight to a decision she'd thought was already made. The house had seemed like salvation, walls and a roof, stability for her children, an escape from basements and charity. But salvation came with a price measured in exhaustion and obligation, in caring for a stranger who'd driven away everyone who should have loved him. I know this story is taking you on an emotional journey, and that's exactly what we're here for. Powerful stories that make you feel something real. If you're invested in Eleanor's choice and want to see where this leads, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who appreciate deep, meaningful storytelling, and your subscription helps us create more content like this. Can I meet him? Eleanor asked finally. Before I decide. Chen nodded. I was hoping you'd ask. The facility is 2 hours from here. I can arrange a visit tomorrow. That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch steps while her children ate sandwiches inside. The sun dropped behind distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the decision weighing on her. The property stretched in all directions, space for the children to run, to breathe, to be loud without disturbing neighbors. Owen had found a creek beyond the tree line. Caleb had already identified repairs he thought they could handle together. Lily had named the squirrel Chester and talked about planting flowers in the spring. How could she explain that this might all disappear? That their fresh start was conditional on her becoming a caregiver to a man she'd never met, someone whose own family had walked away? How could she look at Caleb's face, so serious, so ready to help shoulder whatever burden came next, and tell him they might need to leave? But how could she accept? She was already stretched beyond her limits, already failing at the basic work of keeping her children fed and safe and emotionally intact. Adding an elderly man to that equation, someone who required constant attention and care, felt like volunteering to drown when she was already barely treading water. Caleb came outside, sitting beside her without speaking. They watched the light fade together, mother and son both carrying weights they shouldn't have to carry. Something's wrong, he said finally. With the house. There's something you're not telling us. Eleanor considered lying, considered protecting him from adult complications for a few more days, but Caleb had stopped being a child the day his father died. Pretending otherwise insulted what he'd already survived. There's a condition, she said quietly. To keep the house, I have to take care of someone. An old man, your dad's uncle. He'd live with us, and I'd be responsible for him. Caleb absorbed this information with the careful neutrality he'd developed over the past months. For how long? Until he dies, maybe a year, maybe 2, I don't know yet. And if you say no, we lose the house. We'd have to figure out somewhere else to go. He nodded slowly, processing implications and possibilities with a mind too young for such calculations. Would we go back to the basement? I don't know, sweetheart, maybe, or maybe we'd find something else. They sat in silence while stars began appearing overhead, more stars than Eleanor had ever seen. The sky vast and clear without city lights to dim their brilliance. In the distance, an owl called, a sound both lonely and beautiful, reminding her that survival sometimes meant adapting to circumstances you never chose. We should stay, Caleb said finally. We should take care of him. Owen's different here already. Lily's talking again. And you... He paused, searching for words. You look less tired. Just from one day here, we should stay. Eleanor pulled him close, this boy who'd become wise too quickly, who made impossible choices sound simple because he understood what was at stake. It won't be easy. Nothing's been easy. He leaned against her shoulder. But at least here we'd have space. At least here we'd have our own rooms. At least here, Eleanor thought but didn't say, we'd have a chance. Their small, complicated, exhausting chance at building something that felt like home. The next morning, she called Robert Chen and told him to arrange the visit. She would meet Marcus Whitaker, would look into the eyes of the man whose loneliness had become her obligation, and she would make a choice. Not the choice she wanted, perhaps, but the choice that her children deserved. The choice that might, despite everything, lead them towards something better than the basement darkness they'd left behind. Marcus Whitaker arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, transported by a medical van that navigated the dirt road with practiced caution. Eleanor stood on the porch with her children arranged beside her like nervous soldiers, watching as attendants helped an old man emerge from the vehicle's side door. He was smaller than she'd expected. thin in a way that suggested illness rather than genetics. His frame folded in on itself as though he were trying to occupy less space in the world. White hair stood in wispy patches across a spotted scalp, and his hands shook with a tremor that might have been Parkinson's or simply age. But his eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear, moved across the property with something that looked like relief. "It's been a long time," he said to no one in particular, his voice rough from disuse. The attendants unloaded equipment, a walker he barely used, medications organized in a plastic weekly container, oxygen tanks for emergencies he insisted wouldn't happen. They reviewed instructions Eleanor had already memorized from 2 weeks of training: pill schedules, dietary restrictions, warning signs of cardiac distress. Marcus stood apart during these explanations, gazing at the house like a man who'd returned from exile. After the van departed, silence stretched between them. The children had retreated inside, leaving Eleanor alone with this stranger who was now her responsibility. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, "for agreeing to this arrangement. I know it's not what you wanted." Eleanor chose honesty. "It's not, but we needed the house." He nodded, acknowledging the transactional nature of their relationship without flinching. "I'll try not to be a burden." But burden was exactly what he became, not through cruelty or demands, but through the simple fact of existing in a household already stretched beyond capacity. Eleanor gave him the master bedroom, the largest space with its own bathroom. She moved into the small blue room with Lily, whose nightmares had intensified since the move. Caleb and Owen shared one of the front bedrooms, their belongings crammed into a space meant for one child. The house that had seemed so spacious now felt crowded, every room occupied, every hour scheduled around someone else's needs. Marcus required 3 meals daily, prepared according to dietary restrictions that eliminated salt, fat, and anything that made food taste like more than cardboard. His medications needed administering at specific times: morning pills with food, afternoon pills on an empty stomach, evening pills that couldn't be taken within 2 hours of certain foods. Eleanor set alarms on her phone, reminders that punctuated her days with obligations she couldn't ignore. She found work at a medical supply store 30 minutes away, part-time hours that barely covered groceries and gas. The job required her to be gone 3 afternoons a week, leaving Marcus alone with the children. Caleb took on supervision duties without being asked, checking on Marcus every hour, ensuring he hadn't fallen or forgotten his medications. At 11 years old, he became a de facto caregiver, learning to recognize the signs of shortness of breath, knowing when to call Eleanor versus when to call emergency services. Owen withdrew further into himself. The curiosity that had sparked during their first days at the house dimmed as their lives reorganized around Marcus's schedule. There was no spontaneity anymore, no sudden trips to explore the creek, no afternoons spent in town. Everything required planning around medications and meals, around ensuring someone stayed with Marcus, around the constant low-level vigilance of monitoring an elderly man's health. Lily's brief emergence back into speech reversed. She stopped talking again, communicating through gestures and whispers only Eleanor could hear. The nightmares intensified. She'd wake screaming about abandonment, about being left behind, about houses that trapped people inside. Eleanor would hold her in the darkness, both of them exhausted, while in the next room Marcus's breathing rattled through walls that felt increasingly like prison bars. The monthly stipend Marcus's estate provided covered his expenses, but Eleanor's part-time income barely filled the gaps. The car needed repairs they couldn't afford. Winter approached, and the house's ancient heating system struggled against Montana cold. Caleb's shoes developed holes. Owen needed glasses he'd been squinting without for months, and Lily had contracted a persistent cough that should have been checked by a doctor but wasn't, because the nearest clinic required co-pays Eleanor didn't have. Marcus noticed the strain. He'd sit at the kitchen table during meals, watching the children with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read, something between guilt and longing, awareness and helplessness. He tried to help in small ways, folding laundry with shaking hands, offering to read to Lily, who refused to come near him, but his presence remained a weight, a constant reminder that their lives revolved around keeping him alive, keeping him comfortable, keeping the house that had come to feel less like salvation and more like an obligation they couldn't escape. 3 months after Marcus's arrival, Eleanor found Caleb crying in the shed behind the house. He'd hidden there during a rare moment when Owen was watching Marcus, seeking privacy in the only space that wasn't crowded with need and responsibility. "I'm tired," he told her, his face streaked with tears that broke her heart. "I'm tired all the time, Mom. I can't remember what it feels like to not be worried about something." Eleanor held him, this boy who'd become a man too quickly, and felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd accepted the house thinking it would save them, believing that walls and space equaled security. But she'd traded one form of poverty for another, exchanged financial desperation for emotional depletion, swapped the basement's darkness for a different kind of prison, built from obligation and exhaustion. That night, after the children slept and Marcus had taken his evening medications, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and stack of bills. The numbers refused to balance. Even with the stipend, even with her part-time income, they were drowning slowly. The house needed repairs they couldn't afford. The roof leaked in 2 places, the heating system barely functioned, pipes groaned with the threat of freezing when temperatures dropped. But worse than the financial strain was the emotional cost. She watched her children disappearing into themselves, watched Caleb's childhood evaporating under the weight of adult responsibilities, watched Owen's light dimming as he learned that fresh starts were lies and nothing ever really changed. Lily's silence felt like an accusation, a child who'd briefly found her voice only to lose it again when her mother chose a house over peace. Marcus appeared in the doorway, Walker scraping against old floorboards. "You should sleep," he said quietly. "So should you. Sleep doesn't come easy at my age." He moved slowly to the table, lowering himself into a chair with visible effort. "I'm making your life harder. I see that. I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at him, this stranger who'd accidentally become central to their existence, whose continued survival determined whether her children had beds or basements. "Why did you structure the will this way? Why force someone to care for you?" "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of dying alone in a facility where staff call you sweetheart because they can't remember your name. Afraid of becoming invisible, just another old body waiting for the end. I thought if I offered something valuable enough, someone might tolerate my presence, might let me die with dignity instead of isolation. But you're still isolated. We're not family, Marcus. We're strangers fulfilling a contract." "I know." His hands trembled on the table surface. "I know, and I'm sorrier for that than you'll ever understand. I spent my life making practical decisions, believing that logic and fairness mattered more than connection. I was wrong, but I learned too late to fix it." They sat in silence while the house settled around them, creaking and groaning like something alive. Eleanor thought about dignity and desperation, about the choices people make when they're afraid, about how easy it is to judge someone else's loneliness until you're drowning in your own. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted. "I thought I was strong enough, but I'm watching my children suffer and I don't know how to stop it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time to talk about alternatives." "There are no alternatives. If I break the agreement, we lose everything. Perhaps losing everything is better than losing yourselves." Eleanor met his eyes and saw something unexpected there, not manipulation or guilt, but genuine understanding. This old man who'd traded property for companionship recognized what his presence was costing, understood that sometimes the price of walls and roofs was higher than anyone should have to pay. The conversation left Eleanor lying awake beside Lily's small sleeping form, listening to her daughter's congested breathing, wondering if there was any choice that didn't require sacrificing something essential. Outside, wind moved through pine trees with a sound like distant ocean waves, and Eleanor imagined herself drowning in that sound, sinking beneath obligations she'd chosen but could no longer carry. What she didn't yet know was that the worst strain was still ahead, that winter would bring crises that would force decisions she wasn't ready to make, that would test whether her children's resilience had any limits left, or whether she'd already pushed them past the point where things could ever be okay again. Winter arrived with a cruelty that felt personal. Snow fell in sheets that transformed the dirt road into an impassable stretch of white, cutting them off from town for days at a time. The heating system wheezed and stuttered, pushing lukewarm air through vents that barely reached the upstairs bedrooms. Eleanor stuffed towels under door frames and hung blankets over windows, creating insulation from materials that should have been used for other purposes. Lily's cough worsened into something that rattled in her chest, a wet, desperate sound that kept Eleanor awake, listening for signs it was becoming pneumonia. The drive to town required chains on tires they couldn't afford, and the clinic was only open 3 days a week. Eleanor dosed her daughter with over-the-counter medicine and prayer, checking her temperature obsessively, terrified that the choice to stay in this house would cost her child something irreversible. Marcus's health declined with the cold. His breathing grew labored, and the oxygen tanks became necessary instead of precautionary. He moved less, spending most days in his bedroom with the portable heater Eleanor had bought using money meant for groceries. She brought him meals, administered medications, helped him to the bathroom when the walk seemed too difficult. The intimacy of caring for his body, washing, dressing, monitoring functions that should have been private, created a strange bond neither of them wanted, but both accepted as inevitable. It was during one of these caregiving moments that Marcus began talking about the past. "I had a brother," he said one afternoon while Eleanor changed his bedding. "Richard. He was younger, better with people, the kind of man everyone wanted around. I was the practical one, the one who made hard choices and stuck to principles even when they hurt." Eleanor smoothed the sheets, half listening, focused on the tasks that filled her days. But something in his voice made her pause. Richard had 3 kids, struggled financially his whole life, worked construction, injured his back, couldn't work anymore. He asked me for money, $10,000 to keep his house, to avoid foreclosure. I had it. I could have given it to him without feeling the loss. "But you didn't," Eleanor said quietly. "I gave it to him, but I made it a loan, not a gift. Drew up papers, set repayment terms, treated my brother like a business transaction because I believed in accountability, in not enabling poor decisions." Marcus's hands clenched the blanket. He couldn't repay it. Lost the house anyway 2 years later. I demanded the money back even though I knew he didn't have it. Threatened legal action. Destroyed what was left of our relationship over a principle that mattered more to me than blood. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, understanding beginning to form like ice in her chest. Richard died 5 years after that. Heart attack, same as your husband. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. I didn't go to the funeral because I told myself I wouldn't be welcome. But the truth is, I was too proud to admit I'd been wrong. Marcus's voice cracked. I spent the next decade alienating everyone else the same way. Lending money with conditions, pointing out failures, holding grudges over slights no one else remembered. I thought I was being honest, being fair. I was just being cruel and calling it principle. "The family didn't abandon you," Eleanor said, pieces falling into place. "You pushed them away. I pushed them away and then acted wounded when they stopped trying to reach me. I made my loneliness their fault instead of accepting it was consequence." He looked at her with eyes that held decades of regret. "By the time I understood what I'd done, everyone was gone. Dead or done with me, and I couldn't blame them either way." Eleanor thought about the testamentary condition, the elaborate mechanism Marcus had created to ensure someone would care for him. Not punishment, but desperation. An old man trying to purchase the human connection he'd destroyed through his own rigidity and pride. "Your husband David called me sometimes," Marcus continued. "Every few months he'd check in, never asked for anything, never brought up old grievances, just called to see if I was alive, if I needed anything. He was the only one who still tried, even though we'd barely spoken when he was growing up." "He never mentioned you," Eleanor said, surprised by the sting of that omission. "I asked him not to, didn't want to be a burden or obligation, even in conversation. I think he respected that. Or maybe he just had enough of his own problems." Marcus shifted against the pillows. "When he died, I got a call from someone at the funeral home. They'd found my number in his phone's contacts. That's how I learned he was gone. I wasn't invited to the funeral, didn't expect to be, but I looked into his life afterward, found out about you and the children, about the medical bills and the struggle. So you decided to save us," Eleanor said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "But only if we saved you first." I decided to offer you something I never gave my own family. Help without strings attached to pride. Yes, there's a condition, but it's not about control. It's about ensuring I don't die alone and invisible, tended by strangers who are paid to tolerate me." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm trying to be less selfish than I was, even though it's too late to matter." Eleanor stood, moving to the window where snow continued falling in the fading afternoon light. She thought about David making those calls, maintaining connection with a difficult old man, because it was the right thing to do. She thought about the choice Marcus had made. Not generous, not selfless, but human, in its complicated mixture of need and offering. "The family wasn't wrong to leave you," she said finally. "You hurt them. You chose principles over people and called it integrity. They had every right to protect themselves." "I know." Marcus's agreement came without defense or justification. "I know, and I don't blame them. But Eleanor, understanding why you're alone doesn't make the loneliness hurt less. Deserving isolation doesn't mean you stop craving connection." She turned to face him, this old man who'd accidentally become her burden, whose past mistakes had created the present trap she couldn't escape. "What you did to your family, lending money with conditions, demanding repayment, treating love like a transaction, that's what you're doing to us. You're repeating the same pattern, using resources as leverage for connection." The truth of her words hit Marcus visibly. His face crumpled, decades of regret and self-awareness colliding with the reality of what he'd become. "You're right. God help me. You're absolutely right. I thought I was being better, but I'm still manipulating people into tolerating my presence." "So what do we do?" Eleanor asked, exhaustion making her voice flat. "I can't keep sacrificing my children's well-being for a house, but walking away means starting over with nothing, and I don't know if I'm strong enough for that either." "There might be another option," Marcus said slowly. "Something I've been thinking about but didn't want to suggest because it means admitting I failed again." Before he could explain, Lily's coughing erupted from the next room, harsh, painful sounds that sent Eleanor rushing to her daughter. The child's face was flushed with fever, her breathing rapid and shallow. Eleanor's hands shook as she took Lily's temperature, 103.2 degrees. "Mom?" Caleb appeared in the doorway, Owen behind him, both boys' faces tight with worry. "Get my phone," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to call the clinic." The on-call nurse instructed them to bring Lily in immediately. But outside, the snow had intensified into a blizzard that made the dirt road invisible, that transformed the 15-mile drive into something potentially fatal. Eleanor stood at the window with Lily burning in her arms, weighing risks and impossibilities, wondering how many more times she'd have to choose between bad options and worse ones. Marcus appeared behind her, oxygen tube trailing like an umbilical cord, his breathing labored from the effort of walking. "Take the truck," he said. "Keys are in my nightstand. 4-wheel drive, better in snow than your car. Go now, before it gets worse." "I can't leave you alone. Caleb can stay. He knows what to do." Marcus met her eyes, and in them she saw understanding, the recognition of a mother's terror, the knowledge that some choices override all others. "Save your daughter, Eleanor. We'll deal with everything else after." So Eleanor bundled Lily in blankets and carried her to Marcus's truck, Caleb loading the passenger seat with towels and emergency supplies with efficiency that broke her heart. She drove through white darkness, following instinct more than vision, while her daughter's fever-bright eyes stared at nothing, and her breathing came in ragged gasps that sounded like surrender. The clinic admitted Lily immediately. Bacterial pneumonia, serious but treatable if caught in time. They started antibiotics and fluids, monitoring her oxygen levels, while Eleanor sat beside the hospital bed and felt the weight of every choice she'd made crushing down until she couldn't breathe either. It was past midnight when Caleb called. His voice was calm, too calm, the tone of a child who'd learned to handle emergencies without falling apart. "Mom, something's wrong with Marcus. His breathing is really bad and he's confused. I think you need to come home." Eleanor looked at Lily sleeping under clean white sheets, tended by professionals who knew how to save children. Then she thought of Caleb alone with an old man dying, trying to be strong enough to handle what no 11-year-old should face. "I'm on my way," she said, though she had no idea how she could be in both places at once, how she could keep everyone she was responsible for alive when the world seemed determined to make her choose who mattered most. The hospital staff assured Eleanor that Lily was stable, that the antibiotics were working, that her daughter would recover fully with continued care. But leaving her felt like tearing away skin. Every step toward the parking lot required conscious effort. Every mile back toward the house felt like abandonment. The blizzard had eased to scattered flurries, and the truck navigated the dirt road with determined traction. Eleanor's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her fingers cramped, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios faster than her heart could beat. Caleb alone with a dying man. Owen terrified and helpless. The house becoming a tomb instead of a home because she'd made the wrong choice, accepted the wrong offer, believed walls and roofs could compensate for the price they demanded. She found Caleb in Marcus's bedroom, sitting beside the old man with a composure that looked like shock. Owen was there too, pressed against the wall with his arms wrapped around himself, tears streaming down his face. Marcus lay propped on pillows, his breathing labored and irregular, skin grey in the lamplight. "Ambulance is coming," Caleb said flatly. "I called them 20 minutes ago. The road's bad, so they're delayed." Eleanor moved to Marcus's side, checking his pulse, rapid and thready beneath papery skin. His eyes opened, finding her face with effort. "Lily?" he whispered. "She's going to be okay. Pneumonia, but treatable. She's safe." Relief flickered across his features. "Good, that's good." Each word came between gasping breaths. "Eleanor, listen. The option I mentioned, there's a provision. In the will. If I die before 1 year of care, you keep the house anyway. No further obligation." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Don't talk about dying. The ambulance is coming. 3 months you've cared for me. 3 months of sacrificing your family's well-being for a stranger's comfort. That's enough. More than I deserve." His hand found hers, cold and trembling. "You don't have to keep me alive to keep the house. The provision ensures that. Robert Chen has the paperwork." "You planned this," Eleanor said, understanding washing over her. "You structured it so we'd get the house regardless." "I structured it so you'd have a choice. Care for me if you could bear it, or let me go knowing your children were secure. I never wanted to trap you, Eleanor. I wanted to give you options I never gave anyone else." Distant sirens cut through the night, growing closer. Eleanor held Marcus's hand while Caleb maintained his vigil, and Owen cried quietly against the wall. In that moment, she saw the full picture. An old man trying to purchase redemption through complicated generosity, a family pushed past their limits by circumstances they never chose, and the impossible question of what obligations humans owe to each other when kindness becomes unbearable. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, assessing Marcus's condition with swift competence. Heart failure, acute episode, unstable but transportable. They loaded him onto a stretcher, while Eleanor gathered his medications and identification, moving through practiced motions while her mind spun with implications and choices. At the hospital, Marcus was admitted to intensive care. The doctor, young, exhausted, kind, explained that his heart was failing progressively, that this episode was serious but not necessarily final. With proper care and monitoring, Marcus could stabilize. He might have months left, possibly longer. "What does proper care mean?" Eleanor asked. 24-hour supervision, medical equipment, trained staff available for emergencies, essentially facility care. Home care is possible but challenging, especially in your remote location. The doctor's expression held sympathy without judgment. "I understand there are complicated family circumstances here. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." Eleanor sat in the sterile waiting room with her sons sleeping on chairs beside her, exhausted beyond consciousness. Dawn approached, turning windows grey with early light. She thought about Lily recovering 15 miles away, about Marcus fighting for breath in a room down the hall, about the house waiting empty at the end of its dirt road. She thought about choices, the ones Marcus had made that destroyed his family, the ones David had made calling a difficult old man every few months because connection mattered more than comfort, the ones she'd made accepting a house with conditions attached, because she was desperate, and desperate people don't have the luxury of easy decisions. We're coming to the end of Eleanor's journey, and I want to thank you for staying with us through every difficult choice and painful moment. Stories like this exist because of viewers like you. If this has moved you, if Eleanor's struggle has felt real and important, please subscribe. Help us reach our goal so we can continue bringing you these powerful, emotional stories that remind us what it means to be human. Robert Chen arrived at noon with documents that confirmed what Marcus had said. The testamentary provision stated clearly, if Marcus died within the first year, the property transferred to Eleanor without further obligation. It was insurance, a fail-safe designed to ensure she wasn't trapped, that her children would have security regardless of how long Marcus survived. He never told me this existed, Eleanor said, staring at legal language that changed everything. He instructed me not to, unless it became necessary. He wanted you to choose care freely, without this information influencing your decision. He was trying in his way to do something selfless. Chen's voice held quiet respect. It's imperfect and complicated, like everything Marcus touched. But the intent was genuine. Eleanor returned to Marcus's room where he lay connected to monitors, his breathing assisted by oxygen, his body finally still after decades of running from the consequences of his own rigidity. She pulled a chair close, sitting in the space between his bed and the window where weak winter sunlight struggled through clouds. I'm sending you back to the facility, she said quietly. Not because you're a burden or because I don't care, but because my children have already sacrificed too much. Lily needs her mother present, not split between obligations. Caleb needs to be a child again instead of a caregiver. Owen needs to remember what it feels like to be carefree. And I need to learn how to build a home based on love instead of obligation. Marcus's eyes opened, focusing on her with clarity that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. That's the right choice. I know it is, but it still feels like failure. It's not failure, it's boundaries, something I never learned. He paused, gathering strength. The house is yours, Eleanor. Use it well. Make it a place where your children can heal, where being family means support instead of transaction. Do what I never could. I'll visit you, Eleanor said, surprised to find she meant it. Not out of obligation, but because you're part of our story now. Because David would have wanted someone to remember you're more than your mistakes. That's more grace than I deserve. Maybe, but grace isn't about deserving. It's about choosing connection even when it's complicated. The facility had space available, and transport was arranged for the following week. Marcus would return to professional care, to staff trained in managing his declining health, to a place where his needs didn't compete with children's well-being. He would die there, eventually, likely alone, despite Eleanor's promised visits. But he would die knowing he'd given something without destroying the recipients, had offered help that didn't become trap. Eleanor brought her children to see him before the transfer. They stood awkwardly at the foot of his bed, Caleb serious, Owen shy, Lily still weak but recovering, clutching her stuffed rabbit-like armor. Thank you for taking care of me, Marcus said to them. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm sorry it was so hard. But you're good children and you're going to be okay. Caleb nodded once, accepting the apology with dignity beyond his years. Owen managed a small smile. Lily whispered something too quiet to hear, and when Eleanor asked her to repeat it, she said simply, "Goodbye, Mr. Marcus." They left him there, the old man who'd accidentally taught them about boundaries and grace, about the difference between obligation and choice, about how sometimes walking away is the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved. The house stood waiting, covered in snow but solid, when they returned. Eleanor gathered her children in the living room where they'd spent their first night, and she told them the truth, that the house was truly theirs now, that they didn't have to leave, that Marcus had made it possible for them to stay without continuing to sacrifice their well-being. "So we can stay?" Owen asked, disbelief and hope warring in his voice. "We can stay. This is our home now, for real." The change wasn't immediate. Lily's recovery took weeks, and the nightmares continued for months. Caleb needed time to remember how to be a child, to release the responsibilities he'd carried, and trust that adults could handle things. Owen slowly emerged from his shell, rediscovering curiosity and joy in small moments. Eleanor found full-time work at the medical supply store, and without the demands of constant caregiving, she could be present for her children in ways she hadn't managed before. They ate dinner together at the kitchen table. They explored the property on weekends, discovering the creek and hiking trails through pine forests. They planted a garden in spring, vegetables and flowers that Lily tended with Chester the squirrel supervising from nearby branches. The house gradually transformed from obligation into sanctuary. They repaired the roof together, Eleanor and Caleb working side by side while Owen passed tools and Lily painted the porch railings with meticulous care. They fixed the heating system. Insulated windows made the space truly livable, through effort that felt like investment rather than desperation. Marcus died 8 months after returning to the facility. Eleanor received the call on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week he'd arrived at their home. She felt sadness, genuine, complicated sadness for a man who'd learned his lessons too late, but had tried, in his flawed way, to do better. She took the children to his funeral. There were only a handful of attendees, facility staff who'd cared for him, Robert Chen representing the estate and Eleanor's family. The service was brief, words spoken over a man whose life had been long, but whose impact remained difficult to summarize without acknowledging the harm alongside the late-arriving grace. Was he a good person? Owen asked on the drive home. Eleanor considered the question, searching for truth that honored complexity. He was a person who made mistakes and eventually tried to do better. That's more honest than calling him simply good or bad. We're all more complicated than single words can describe. But he gave us the house, Lily said quietly. That was good. Yes, sweetheart, that was good. And we honored him by accepting it, but also by knowing when to stop sacrificing ourselves. Both things can be true. The house at the end of the dirt road became the place where Eleanor's children learned that home isn't about walls or ownership. It's about safety, presence, and the freedom to be imperfect without fear. They learned that obligations have limits, that caring for others includes caring for yourself, that sometimes the kindest choice looks like walking away. Eleanor stood on the porch one evening as summer sun painted the mountains gold, watching her children play in the yard with the ease of those who finally felt secure. Caleb was laughing, actually laughing, at something Owen said. Lily was singing to herself, a made-up song about rabbits and gardens. They looked like children again instead of survivors, and Eleanor felt the weight she'd carried for so long finally begin to lift. The house had cost them dearly. Exhaustion, tears, moments of despair when giving up felt like the only option. But it had also taught them something essential, that dignity isn't inherited through property or obligation. It's built through daily choices to honor both others and yourself, to care without martyrdom, to accept help while maintaining boundaries. Marcus had tried to buy connection and ended up teaching them about freedom. Eleanor had accepted obligation and learned about grace. Her children had survived circumstances they shouldn't have faced and emerged stronger, wiser, more aware of their own worth. The dirt road that had once felt like isolation now felt like privacy. The space that had seemed overwhelming now provided room to breathe. The walls that came with conditions now stood solid and unconditional, shelter earned through surviving rather than through sacrifice that destroyed. Eleanor called her children inside as twilight deepened, gathering them around the kitchen table for dinner in the home that was finally, truly, completely theirs. And in that moment, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of children talking over each other, of food shared and laughter rising, she understood what Marcus had been trying to give them all along. Not a house, but a chance. Not obligation, but possibility. Not perfection, but the messy, complicated, beautiful opportunity to build something that mattered from the broken pieces of what came before. They had survived. They had chosen themselves. And in doing so, they had finally come home.